With Monmouth heading towards the Channel with just 3 ships, their holds full of gunpowder, muskets, armour, and 87 men, what actually awaited the now rebel Duke? Monmouth was surely hoping for what had been promised so many times, a country who would not accept the newly crowned Catholic king, his uncle James II. A country full of stout-hearted Protestants who had rallied to his colours, and seeing this, his former military comrades would bring over the royal army and militias to his side. This armed rebellion would soon turn into a royal progress, with the Duke being cheered by adoring crowds all the way to London. And by the time he arrived at the capital, his uncle would have seen that the game was up and fled. Well, that was the hope, but what was the reality? It was not quite as ripe for rebellion as what the Duke might have been led to believe. Yes, the country had a Catholic monarch on the throne, the first since Bloody Mary. For decades, the country had been paralysed with the fears of a papist king bringing back arbitrary government, alliances with foreign Catholic powers, and of course, the burnings of the Tudor age. Cries of "Down with Popery," "Remember the 5th of November," and "41 has come again," had plagued the late King Charles II and the former Duke of York. And now it was as though the country's greatest fears had come to pass. And yet the succession had happened without any bloodshed. The terrible years of the Popish plot, the Exclusion Crisis, and the Rye House plot appeared to be a thing of the past. As soon as James had become king, he had assured Parliament that he was no threat to the Protestant Church, and even more, he would protect it. He was not, it seemed, going to be a threat. This would allow the whole country to breathe a collective sigh of relief. The wonderful historical drama, The First Churchills, captures this very moment.
My lords, it is my duty to address you. Oh, God knows that it's hard for me to speak. An hour since, you had a gracious king, and I, a kind brother. Now he is dead. In succeeding him, I shall endeavour to follow his example, and most especially to continue his great clemency and tenderness to his people. I have been reported often as a man for arbitrary power, but that falsehood is only one of many. I am resolved to preserve this government, both in church and state, as it is by law established. I know that the principles of the Church of England are for monarchy. Therefore, I shall always take care to defend and support that church. As regards my own private religious opinions, no man shall perceive that I entertain them. Before this, I have often ventured my life in defense of this nation. I shall still go as far as any man in preserving all its just rights and liberties.
Well said, Your Majesty.
Your Majesty, as Lord President of your Council, may I express our gratitude for this noble declaration.
Indeed.
May I humbly beg Your Majesty that it be printed and published abroad for the gratification of all your subjects.
Aye.
Very well. Very well, you may do so.
And so, if Monmouth were to land, would Protestants rise against a king who had only just promised to leave their precious religion alone? Would the army mutiny against their new king, even though he had not filled it with ranks of Catholics and Irish soldiers? What about the nobility and gentry, the men of power who were so vital to the success of Monmouth's last gamble? They had promised much, but as stated before, Monmouth had nothing definite and certainly nothing in writing. And on top of this, there had to be men who could lead, men who, if they sided with Monmouth, would bring over great men into the cause. But so many strong men had been removed in the preceding years. Men such as Essex, Russell, and Armstrong had been executed or murdered. Thomas Tyne, who had commanded the Dorsetshire militia, had been killed in a 17th century drive-by shooting in 1682. As a close friend to Monmouth, if he had still been alive in 1685, might have been able to bring the whole of the militia forces over to Monmouth. It would certainly have given the Duke a huge impetus at the start of his campaign. The lack of leading men was foreseen by the tragic figure of the Lord Russell. Russell at his trial commented, "A rebellion cannot be made now, as it has in former times. We have few very great men." The great Whig leader and rabble-rouser Lord Shaftesbury was now dead as well. For the Whig cause, too many heads of the Hydra had been cut off. For now, for good or for bad, the Tories were in control and all-powerful. But we must state that Monmouth was not going to be landing in a country that had no idea that he was on his way. The news that a rebellion was being planned and had sailed was well known in government and royal circles. The only intelligence they did not have was where he was going and when he was going to land. Many believed that he had sailed to Scotland to assist Argyll in his invasion of the Western Highlands. But the royal forces were on alert, and the local militias were instructed to be on the lookout for suspicious individuals, unusual conventicles, and to seek out illegal weapon stores. The English envoy for the Netherlands, the unfortunate Bevel Skelton, reported this rather obvious intelligence to the Earl of Middleton. It almost seems too easy for the English authorities. It's whispered about that Monmouth intends speedily to pass over into England and land in the west part of the kingdom, and those who have gone before are sent to prepare for his reception. Here it seemed was solid proof of Monmouth's desire to land in the West Country, and that messengers had already been sent there to begin preparing the way. The government acted with the limited forces they had at their disposal. Warrants were sent out to arrest known Whig leaders and potential plotters. Deputy lieutenants were authorised to search out, disarm, and detain any dangerous and suspected persons. But even though information had been passed to the king that Monmouth was to land in the west, care still needed to be taken. The royal army was small, independent garrisons were few and far between, and the county militias, well, they weren't that reliable, as we will see in the next few episodes. And what about the West Country, where Monmouth would land? Was it ready for rebellion? Were men just waiting for the news that the Protestant Duke had landed? News which would see them grabbing their concealed weapons and marching towards his colours? Of course there were. Monmouth had agents travelling to and fro from the capital, keeping the local gentry and populace informed of the Duke's intentions. Conventicles of dissenters would meet out in the countryside, away from prying eyes and royal snoopers. These illicit meetings would be attended by people who would travel many, many miles. Here, as well as religious preachings, news would be discussed from London, and any news from the continent would be eagerly lapped up. But with so much news being passed about, no matter how careful people were, the news would eventually reach the wrong ears. Real news was soon blended with fake news, reality blurred into fiction. A woman in the West Country reported to the authorities that she saw and heard around 80 horsemen galloping in the distance in the middle of the night. Were these royalist dragoons or potential rebels hiding to a clandestine hideout? It was a society of paranoia, of whispered conversations, of clandestine meetings, and of reporting on your neighbours. Reporting on illegal doings could earn the snooper a decent amount of money. It wasn't safe either to send a letter to a secret correspondence. Thanks to Sir Samuel Morland, letters could be opened without the receiver realising it had been already read. Morland was described as being able to open letters more skillfully than anyone in the world. But for the authorities, it was not all plain sailing in discovering plots and treasonous activities. Once below the levels of the well-known gentry, who were known troublemakers, finding real evidence was not easy. As more and more evidence poured across the North Sea, the government ordered local searches to winkle out arms and armour and illegal conventicles. An example is the Buckinghamshire house of Lord Wharton, where a large consignment of pistols, muskets, and armour were discovered. It was enough to equip around 24 men. Hardly an army, but still potentially dangerous. All over the country, including the volatile West Country, potential rebels were kept under a close watch. But the autumn of 1684 and through the winter of early 1685, all seemed quiet. Even the death of Charles II saw very little local disquiet. It was so quiet in the early days of the reign of James II that it almost seemed that the Whig cause had been extinguished. Lost without their heavyweight leaders, it was so quiet in the early days, Shaftesbury in particular, hammered by constant fines, imprisoned, and troops billeted on them. Perhaps they had just had enough. Was their cause finally lost? The government of the James II had acted quickly on the new king's orders. The king demanded that all ports were put on special alert and were to stop and search all persons travelling to and from the British Isles. Not an easy task in the 17th century, especially when those in power did not enforce these royal commands thoroughly. The Mayor of Dover complained to the Earl of Middleton about his colleague, the Mayor of Folkestone. The Dover Mayor wrote, "But notwithstanding, he permits boats daily to go to sea." And it wasn't just England that James II was concerned with. Just as his ancestors had, he had inherited multiple kingdoms, Scotland to the north and Ireland to the west. Scotland was still a powder keg ready to explode into renewed rebellion. The extreme Presbyterians or Covenanters were just waiting to avenge their defeat at Bothwell Bridge. All they needed was a leader, a head, a man of passion and vision to unite them once more. That man had already sailed to the Western Islands and was about to land. That man was the Earl of Argyll. Ireland too was an unsettling presence just off the coast. In the reign of the late Charles II, it had seen the odd disturbance. But despite Popish plot, the exclusion crisis and the Rye House plot, the Irish had remained remarkably peaceful. Would the outnumbered Protestant settlers, surrounded by a hostile Catholic population, lash out at the new Catholic king? Or would the Catholics rise up, assured their new king would support them? Ireland, as would be seen in a few years' time, was balanced on a knife edge, all too ready to fall into chaos. For the common people, right up to the king himself, it was a worrying time. But what about the new king himself? What did he think about the disturbing news flooding in on an almost daily basis? The king, I believe, deep down, was quietly happy about this rebellion. Despite being a royal, he had had a tough life. His father had been executed. He and his family had been forced into a penniless exile, begging and scraping an existence from the court of Louis XIV. His whole life he had played second fiddle to his brother, had watched him bend and bow to the heretical views of his Protestant and Whig subjects. Even during his brother's reign, he had been expelled from England and seen his rightful claim to the throne threatened on several occasions. His fervent Catholicism led to self-loathing, which would lead to rampant womanizing, which would lead to self-hate, and so on and so on. But in 1685, against all the odds, he had finally become king. He was now in charge. He would not allow his annoying nephew, his younger, slimmer, more handsome, more athletic nephew to win. He had had to wait for so long, fight so hard, and he saw this rebellion as a very personal challenge. Monmouth could not have had a more steadfast enemy at this time. It may seem odd to say that the king would be seen to welcome the rebellion, but it would give him the perfect excuse to drastically increase the size of his army, an act he was to do immediately after the rebellion. He despised nonconformists, dissenters, old Cromwellians, Republicans, men of the good old cause, in essence, the men who executed his father and forced himself and his brother into an 11-year exile. He would not see his kingdom return to the dark, foreboding years of Cromwell, the major generals, and the Interregnum. James himself, though, was never seen as a great strategist or even a battlefield or naval commander, but he was brave. At the Battle of Sole Bay, perhaps due to his stubborn nature, he had many flagships battered beneath him. Stubborn he may have been, but in front of the cannon's mouth, he did not lack courage. One of his underappreciated strengths, however, was that of an administrator. So as the rebellion erupted, The logistics, planning and orders needed to defeat his nephew must have delighted the new king. How would he defeat this rapidly expanding rebel army? What forces had the king at his disposal? What could the militia do? What supplies did they need? Who was to command? How to keep the local populations loyal? And not forgetting, the king had the Argyll arm of the rebellion to contain and then crush at the same time. For James, the black and white of administration must have suited his Catholic way of living. Things were simple. So many men needed so much food. A regiment could march in so many miles in a day. So many muskets meant so many pikemen. Things were definite, able to be planned, so far removed from the indifferent loyalties of men and the heresy, as he saw it, of the Protestant religion. The king, though, had to resist erratic decisions, bide his time, increase what forces he could, and keep the main bulk of his army in and around London. If London fell, it would all be over. Events, though, would soon overtake any plans the king had been making. On the 30th of May, 2 letters were intercepted from London, one destined for Ilminster, the other for Taunton, that hotbed of dissent. The letters ran, "Friend, these are to advise thee that honest Protestants forthwith prepare and make themselves very ready, for they have at this notice here at court that a certain person will forthwith appear in the West." The searches, arrests, and fear all increased. Mayors, deputy lieutenants, justices, they all continued their searches and raids, especially at Exeter Fair and Taunton, which was seen as a centre of sedition and rebellious talk. Soon after these 2 explosive communications were captured, Sir William Portman, one of the colonels of the Somerset militia, received an alarming letter whilst in London. It ran that he verily believed that the dissenting party had some wicked designs afoot, for that their countenances and manners in conversation seemed different of late to what they have been. Portman would play a crucial role in the latter part of the Monmouth Rebellion, a role in which he saved Monmouth from perhaps an instant death for a prolonged agony on the scaffold. The Kingdom of England, anyway, seemed peaceful enough. Even the apparition of 80 nighttime horsemen was soon forgotten. The royal army was still ordered to remain close to London. Royal forces were gathering around Argyll's landing in Scotland, and Monmouth, our hero, is struggling in the Channel against adverse winds. But he will be landing very soon. In our next episode, our hero, James Scott, Duke of Monmouth, will be back in England, landing at Lyme Regis in Dorset. His campaign to rid himself of his hated uncle will begin. We'll see you very soon on the very spot he landed. As always, thanks for watching.